Donald Trump is finally really upset about police use of deadly force against unarmed black men.
Well, I say that it's a very scary time for young men in America when you can be guilty of something that you may not be guilty of. This is a very difficult time.
Nah, he wasn't talking about America's enduring problem of police use of deadly force against unarmed black men. He was talking about himself and people he knows, like Brett Kavanaugh, who get accused of sexual assault. Of course, the big difference between Donald Trump and Brett Kavanaugh is that Donald Trump has actually admitted that he is a sexual assaulter, and he has described exactly the way he likes to grab women when he first meets them and assaults them. So why is it so scary for young men in America who might be accused of? This is the country where you can still grow up to be president, even if you are very credibly accused of sexual assault, and even if you actually admit to it yourself.
You could be somebody that was perfect your entire life, and somebody could accuse you of something. Doesn't necessarily have to be a woman, as everybody says, but somebody could accuse you of something, and you're automatically guilty. But in this realm, you are truly guilty until proven innocent. That's one of the very bad things that's taking place right now.
Joining us now, Jason Johnson, politics editor at TheRoot.com and an MSNBC contributor, and Dahlia Lithwick is back with us. And so, Jason, Donald Trump doesn't see any of this as a teachable moment for the men of America, doesn't see it as a teachable moment for his young son.
Of course not, because the president is a living example that you can be abusive. You can be verbally abusive to women. You can be physically abusive to women. You can be professionally abusive to women. You can be sexually abusive to women. And 53% of white women in America will still vote for you. That's what he is operating under. And I think we need to talk about the fact that for every horrible, wretched thing that the president says in support of misogynistic and violent men, there are women in this country who are just as invested in that kind of patriarchy. And we have to address that as well, because that is part of why men like Brett Kavanaugh have been able to squirt through in their lives. Men like Donald Trump have been able to get through in their lives, because there are also women that support them in this kind of behavior. And
Dahlia, it wouldn't occur to Donald Trump just how scary the world has been. A world that has a crime called rape. It has an attack on a human being called rape. And that's never crossed Donald Trump's mind of what it's like to live with that.
It's an extraordinary lesson in, first of all, the rule of Trump is, but enough about Kavanaugh, let's talk about me, right? And yes, immediately the narcissism kicks in, and now we're talking about him. And it's an extraordinary moment if you have lived the week this country has lived, where I'm sure it's happened to you. Women I've known for decades are coming out and saying, I'm now coming forward, this is killing me, I'm going to tell my truth. And we've seen that explode into reality, and an amazing Washington Post story today about why women don't tell their fathers. And for Donald Trump to be wearing the Donald Trump, Roy Moore, Rob Porter headphones that are just like that poor guy. You know, all of the reality that has been materially true in a way this week that I've never seen, that just elides him completely, because all he can think about is that these 1 in 4, 1 in 3 women who are reporting sexual assault are all lying to set up men and maybe extract money.
And Jason, it's even more perverse than that with Donald Trump. He had a bunch of Republicans in the Rose Garden the other day for this discussion about trade, and he pointed to them and said, there's stories about every one of them. Except Mike Pence. Yeah. He said there are stories about every one of them that Donald Trump has heard. He's lying, of course. He's making that up. But those buffoons, those Republican buffoons, sat there and laughed and clapped when Donald Trump accused every one of them of being at least as guilty as Brett Kavanaugh of sexual assault.
Well, we hope he was kidding, right? I mean, we don't know what the president might know.
Well, he doesn't know anything.
But I think
it was like all Trump accusations. It's based on absolutely nothing. Whether he coincidentally was correct about some of them is another matter. Yeah.
Right. I think, though, and Lawrence, you point out the most dangerous thing about this is that they all laughed. that they co-sign this kind of abusive behavior, that he's surrounded by that kind of locker room talk that allows this president to feel that this is okay. And I think one of the most disturbing things that we've seen, above and beyond the possibility of Brett Kavanaugh getting on the Supreme Court after all of this, is to see an entire political party basically gaslight sexual violence survivors in this country for 7 days. I have heard so many people, men and women in my life, talk about how this is traumatizing to watch, and to see a president of the United States mock and defend this man, a man who arguably hasn't done a good job of defending himself. Brett Kavanaugh is doing so much damage to the mental and emotional state of this country. It is an embarrassment. And I hope that anybody, any of these Republican senators, and certainly some of these wavering Democrats, if they watch this president's behavior, if they watch him at this rally tonight, they should be ashamed of themselves if they can still vote for Brett Kavanaugh or Bart Kavanaugh.
And Dahlia, my parents and the nuns who had me in elementary school scared me very clearly about my capacity as a child to do something that I would regret for the rest of my life, to do something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. And my decision upon learning that was to not do anything like that. I didn't live in some terror that I might.
I have tween and teenage boys, and I think that we have, as a country, done such extraordinary work in the last few years trying to explain to them about consent and about alcohol and about confusion and mixed signals. And Donald Trump gets a whole bunch of people in Mississippi chanting, "Lock her up," about Christine Blasey Ford, who did nothing other than come forward and tell, to the best of her recollection, the truth. And the idea that we can set this back, that we can in fact say, not just watch what you do because you can hurt someone. I like to think we're still communicating that to our children, but that if you are a victim of something that was confusing and unclear and embarrassing and filled with laughter by the perpetrators, and you come forward, a whole bunch of people in Mississippi are going to chant, "Lock her up." It's you keep thinking it's rock bottom, and then there's a basement.
Mississippi holding on to its place in the traditional, very, very darkest corners of American culture. Jason Johnson, Dahlia Lithwick, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.